Yeah, it's like
back in to help us remember and celebrate Oscar Hamlin, who was actually, many of you were not here for the previous session. He was exactly like many of you, born in Brooklyn, went to Brooklyn College as an undergraduate, and then went on to become a very distinguished and sometimes controversial scholar of immigration. And donated his papers to Brooklyn College, so if you ever want to write a paper on him, all you have to do is go to the archives. But what we have here are three incontrovertibly brilliant scholars and observers of immigration who will talk about Professor Handlin's, late Professor Handlin's legacy. And so without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. And many years ago, if you had told me when I was trying to convince a student visa officer in Mumbai that I wasn't intending to immigrate to the United States, I would never have foretold that I would be moderating. So Professor Jacobson, whom many of you have read, Matthew Jacobson, is a professor of history and American studies at Yale University. He really has revolutionized the way we think about race, certainly the way I think about race, and many of us, and immigration, with his many path-breaking books. Most recently, you know all of them, I know. Relatively recently, Roots to White Ethnic Revival in Post-Civil War America. Civil Rights America, sorry. When I asked Professor Jacobson what the title of his talk was going to be, he said, quote, he suggested, quote, Oscar Handlin and Me, my 30-year argument with a man I never met. And so I begin, Professor Jacobson.
I trust you can hear me? Yes. Okay. I had a very funny experience this morning as I was listening to Ginny Yan speaking, because if you had asked me at 9:30 what I had read of Oscar Handlin's, I think I would have just said The Uprooted really is pretty much it. And then Ginny kept mentioning all these titles, and I was like, yeah, I read that, I read that, oh, I read that. Actually, I wrote about that, you know. So I think I've actually read pretty much all of it. And I think this speaks to the power that The Uprooted had for me. It was a book, and I will forever be indebted to Oscar Handlin, because it was a book that, at the time I read it as an undergraduate in the 1970s, which still shocks me that this was 20 years at least after he had written it. But when I read it, it fired my imagination like nothing else that I had ever read. And many immigration historians will tell you that they truly and literally owe it to Oscar Handlin that they went into the line of work that they did, and I'm certainly one of those, even though so much of my career has been focused on kind of arguing against him in ways that I'll talk about in a minute. For those of you who haven't read The Uprooted, and I will assume there might be a couple of you in the room, it's a book that is just gorgeous. And for me, I was a literature student who was becoming more and more interested in history over my 4 years of college, and by the time I encountered The Uprooted, it was really the first history book I'd ever read that showed me that the writing of history can be a beautiful thing. It's a lyrical book. It's written very self-consciously, kind of in a dramatic mode, even a tragic mode. It's written, the kind of narrative device of it is, it follows a kind of immigrant everyman from some unspecified place in Europe. So you never are sure whether you're talking about County Cork or Green Kishkis in the Jewish Pale settlement or the Mezzogiorno, but you have this kind of prototypical immigrant facing the prototypical currents of the late 19th century and getting swept along by history into this new place and resettling and facing all of these trials and tribulations. And it's epic. in that way, and it's very poetic in that way. And even though it turns out, as now 2 or 3 generations of historians have argued, that Handlin had many of the details wrong, what he did do was capture the kind of gross contours of the experience in the kind of epic format that actually gives it its due. So in that sense, I was kind of captured by immigration as a topic, quite literally by this one writer, and it changed the kinds of questions I was asking, it changed the kind of student I was, and it changed my direction. Now I should say, I mean, as powerful as the work is, that, and still is, that I was situated historically to really respond to it. And I've done some time thinking about this, and Ginny mentioned this morning that I was just a child when so many of these debates were going on, which is true. So just to kind of put this on a timeline, and I'm going to talk about my argument with Handlin, not because I think I'm so important, but because I think that my argument with Handlin ongoing really captures some of the important trends in the field over the 30 years or so since I first entered it. But I was situated historically to really respond to an epic and lyrical and wonderful book about immigration because I came to consciousness amid an America that was having a newfound romance with the immigrant, of which Handlin's work was kind of an outpost on the leading edge of this in the 1950s. But I was born in 1958. That's the year that John F. Kennedy wrote Nation of Immigrants, which was a kind of opening salvo in the debates over immigration policy that would culminate in the law signed by Johnson in 1965. But just that paradigm, Nation of Immigrants, that Kennedy felt he wanted to put out there as a revision of our understanding of what America was, I think signals something new in the discourse over our national history and our national character. So that he writes that the year I was born. I was 2 when Abraham Cahan's book, The Rise of David Levinsky, which had been languishing for 2 generations in oblivion, was put out again in paperback in a new popular format. That this again was the kind of beginning of a trend in American literature that will end up with writers like Mario Puzo and Erica Zhang writing new works about ethnic identity, but it becomes a minor cottage industry of reprints of these old lost books like Jews Without Money, Cahan's work, Anzi Yazierska, and onward. I was 5 when President Kennedy returned to Ireland and pronounced, now from the position of the President of the United States, pronounced a relationship both to Ireland but also to his own Irish ancestry in a way that was quite new. And he didn't single-handedly create the ethnic revival of the 60s and 70s, but that was a signal moment in his history of the kind of rediscovery and valorization of immigrant identity and what it might mean. 1963 was the same year that Elia Kazan comes out with America, a box office flop, but really one of the first Hollywood epics devoted to immigration. And it's also the year of Beyond the Melting Pot, in which Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan announced that the melting pot really doesn't work the way we've discussed. I was 10 years old when a TV show called Bridget Loves Burning came on TV, along with, some of you might remember, a show called Arnie, about a Greek worker in Continental Flange Factory. He was played by Herschel Bernardi, who was actually a blacklisted actor from a generation earlier. But Bridget Loves Bernie and Arnie are the 2 shows that really kind of saved American TV from the white bread world of Leave It to Beaver and the Dick Van Dyke Show. And going forward from that point, television kind of repopulates white America with immigrants named Arthur Fonzarelli and Carla Tortelli and Rhoda Morgenstern, and you can just multiply Banachek, Starsky, Cagney and Lacey, Laverne DeFazio. I mean, the white population of television after 1968 completely changes, and it is attached to this notion. These shows aren't always telling the story of immigration, but they imply a history that's refracted through Ellis Island in a way that I think is paying homage to this kind of more general romance of the immigrant saga. And of course then Hollywood Fiddler on the Roof, The Godfather, the two most famous, but again, Hollywood also makes a cottage industry out of telling this story. I graduated from high school in the bicentennial year, in which America feverishly rediscovered its own roots, and then sure enough, a year later, Roots, that paean to African American history, is aired. 80 million people watch it, and as you know, 80 million people then run to the archives, not so much to study African American history, but to rediscover their own villages and lost past. As The Nation magazine put it at the time, everyone wants a village to look back to. So there's a kind of anti-modernism to this movement that I think is really important, but the new ethnicity became one of its chief idioms, and I was, again, I was shaped by this discourse, but I was in a sense also kind of a benefactor of this discourse, for better or worse. And then, of course, the capstone to all of this is Ellis Island. If you had mentioned the name Ellis Island the year I was born, not many people would have known what you were talking about. By the time I was in high school, Ellis Island had millions of dollars devoted to its restoration. By the time I was in graduate school, Ellis Island had become the jewel in the crown of the National Park Service. And today, Ellis Island gets more visitors per year than it ever did, as tourists, than it ever did immigrants coming through it. So Ellis Island, I think, signals how deep this discourse ran. I mean, it really reshaped the state. You know, if you want to think about George Bush, right, and when he gave his 1-year anniversary speech after 9/11, where did he go? He went to Ellis Island because it's such a convenient place to say we are a nation of immigrants. Therefore, the whole world should sympathize with our plight and with our policies. So I grew up amid this kind of remaking of the national narrative, this romance with the European immigrant. I want to stress the European here because I'll come back to this in a minute, but the European immigrant was very much at the center of this, as the European immigrant was very much at the center of Handlin's work in The Uprooted. So I was positioned by this history to already kind of respond to this work, and respond I did. When I went to graduate school, I found myself kind of ironically surrounded by people who similarly felt indebted to Handlin, but who were feverishly kind of trying to tear him down, trying to burn down his house, as Ginny Yans put it. Now, among the revisions, and I'll just say a little bit just to kind of capture the generational debate and also to flesh out what Professor Yans was saying about that generation that came between, or intellectual generation anyway, that came between Handlin and myself. I think that the shifts that were underway by the time I got to graduate school in the 80s were best summed up by a volume that came out by John Bodner called The Transplanted, which was very much a self-conscious response to The Uprooted, and the titles kind of say it all about what the shift was from The Uprooted to The Transplanted. I don't want to give Bodner all the credit. I mean, he really was synthesizing a whole generation's work. But the gist of it is, one, where Handlin had depicted a group of kind of pre-modern or pre-industrial peasants being swept along on currents that they didn't necessarily understand. The model in The Transplanted is more, no, they might have lived in places that were pre-industrial, but they had already become capitalists. That migration itself is a capitalist strategy. And these are people who actually had a savvy understanding of the market. They had already made the choice to be wage earners in industrial centers before they left County Cork or Green Kishkas. And so to cast it in this kind of melodrama of the pre-modern being kind of confronted in a jarring way by the modern world, there might be a kernel of truth in that, but it's a distortion. We really need to understand migration itself as a capitalist strategy, and quite a complicated one at that. Where Handlin had really focused on the alienation part of the story, so they find themselves in this new world and it's jarring in every way. The generation represented by The Transplanted is saying, no, you know, actually when you look at it, the continuities that they created in their neighborhoods, in their families, in their churches and temples, in their union organizations, there are a million different ways through their associational activities and their insurance cooperatives. There are a million different ways that they arrived here and kind of rebuilt their old world here in the new in ways that really argue against the kind of alienation pieces that Handlin have been pushing. And you can go down the line. I mean, you can just tick down the theme by theme and kind of see how this generation of social historians, in really starting in the late 60s and on through the 70s, had been revising the model that Handlin had bequeathed them. When I wrote my first book, which is devoted to the question of immigrant nationalisms, I got interested in the question, why is it that so many people came to this country and then got involved in the politics of their homeland? You know, why is Irish nationalism so powerful in the United States? Not only among the migrating generation, but on down the line, generations later. Irish nationalism in some sense is fiercer in the US than it is in many parts of Ireland. Same with Polish nationalism. We find that bicentennial year and after, when I was just kind of coming to my own consciousness, there were thousands of fourth generation Polish Americans who were flocking to Poland to get involved in the Solidarity movement, or what was becoming the Solidarity movement. What's that about? American Zionism. So there are all these examples at hand, and the question was, why does that happen? Why do people come to the US and then get involved in the politics of the homeland? Now, part of the answer to that is rooted in the history that had been told by the transplanted. It's all about those institutions that the immigrants built and the world that they created here that kept them kind of within the fold of their old identities, but also kept them oriented towards the old world in a particular way. But I had to admit to myself, and ultimately to the world, that part of this was something that Handlin was right about. You know, you can't really write about that orientation towards the old world without really taking seriously something of what Handlin was saying about the alienation, or at least taking into account what alienation kind of means in the context of a transnational experience. So that book, which is called Special Sorrows, devoted to immigrant nationalisms, wasn't self-consciously at the time devoted to reincorporating Handlin or redisseminating his ideas. I wasn't thinking about that so consciously, but when I look back at the book now, I can see that that's part of the thing I was working at was, you know, what does it look like when you take the insights of the transplanted generation and now go back and revisit the uprooted and kind of think about this. One of the key moments for me in that research was running across this great reference in a memoir by Eva Hoffman, who is a more recent immigrant from Poland. And she describes being a schoolgirl in Canada and looking at the map of the world that's hanging on her classroom wall and kind of seeing herself situated now at the very center of the map in Canada. And then looking around and trying to find where Warsaw must be and finding it way out here on the margins and realizing that she's from the margins of her classmates' world, or she's living on the margins of her own world. But either way, her cognitive geography she's totally screwed up. And that's something that Handlin has actually situated us pretty well to think about. So in that sense, I think that first book of mine was synthetic in trying to bring together a couple of different traditions of thought in the immigration historiography. Which is just to say that I've been in conversation, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, with Oscar Handlin since the 1970s, and I'll just end with my kind of current reflections on what his work means and what it might mean and what it portends and where we really vigorously need to keep fighting against it. There is something really profound and important in the kind of democratic impulse of what it meant for Handlin to be writing about the immigrant experience as American history at the moment that he was doing that. That was a kind of leap of imagination that not all historians were making. In fact, almost none were. And I think that democratic impulse is something that we need to honor and that we need to carry forward. I think it's something really important. Democratic with a small d, and also kind of populist, I suppose, or proletarian. And half a generation later, people would comfortably refer to this as history from the bottom up. There's something really important about where his work is situated in that intellectual history. But the Eurocentrism of his view, I think, is so much easier to see in the post-civil rights era, how problematic that is. And most of my career has been spent kind of arguing against that. That because of that romance with the European immigrant, not just his romance, but the nation's romance, the nation of immigrants paradigm has become, ironically, one of the easiest places to kind of obscure, or the easiest instruments to obscure some really important things about our history that we'd best not forget. So we like to celebrate America as a nation whose peculiar genius lies in the area of individual liberties, right? That's what this country is really about. Meanwhile, Africans were enslaved as a group and emancipated as a group. Chinese were excluded as a group. Women were disenfranchised as a group and then enfranchised as a group. Japanese were interned as a group. And you can go on and on. This is a nation, people had been, conquered and annexed against their will as groups, whether in Hawaii or Puerto Rico or in what's now the Southwest of the United States. This is really a country made up on histories in collision in very important ways. And to kind of facilely call it a nation of immigrants is to erase far more of American history than you're actually revealing. The paradigm hides from us some of the most important things we need to know about the country, and it posits the voluntary white migrant as the prototypical citizen in a context where people entered the polity through all kinds of different trajectories that are erased or forgotten at our peril. So in that sense, I remain dedicated against Oscar Handlin, because I think that the paradigm, which was not his single authorship, but that Nation of Immigrants paradigm is something that he did participate in and he did bequeath to us, and I think that we need to take what's good and usable from it, but really fight against what is not. And I will leave my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a marvelous talk. Our next speaker is Professor Jose Moya. He's a professor of history at Barnard College and the prize-winning author of Cousins and Strangers, Spanish Immigrants in Buenos Aires, 1850 to 1930. Not to mention lots of other very impressive works on global migration, gender, and labor. Among many other things, he directs the Forum on Migration at Barnard College. And the title of his talk is Handlin in a Wider Perspective, U.S. Immigration Then and Now in Global Comparison. So let's welcome Professor
So thanks for coming, thanks for the invitation. I have a relationship to handling that is quite interesting. I didn't read handling until I read dozens of attacks on handling. How handling was wrong, how handling was simplistic, how handling, And then finally, much later, on my own, really, because you were not supposed to read handling, it was too so passé. I read handling, and it turns out that it was much more sophisticated and enlightening and deep than most of his critics, which is not often it's often the case, actually. So what I wanted to do is point out basically 4 elements that I think are critical in his work, in his intellectual opus in general, and that I think tells us a lot about the man, but also about his times, about the immigrant experience in the U.S. I think he had a lot of things right, as we have been saying here. And also about that immigrant experience plays in the national narrative, in the American self-perception, in national self-perception, and particularly national mythology also. I mean, all national self-perceptions include strong element of mythology. And the first of these elements is what you could call U.S. centrism. It is true that he was an internationalist, but even his internationalism was very US-centric. The US was the beacon of freedom, and the US had the duty of saving the rest of the world, or sometimes even redeem. There's a redemption component to that. But we don't need to know much about the rest of the world, since we're going to redeem them, right? In the uproar, for example, there is not a single mention of Argentina, another country of immigration, or a mention of Australia, or Canada, or Southeast Asia, another region of immigration, or North Asia and Siberia, another big, or Manchuria, places that were receiving tens of millions of immigrants. So this is totally oblivious to all of that. The same is true of his focus on the Irish immigrants. There is a sentence on Canada and Australia, but that's about it. I learned out that his interest in slavery in the Caribbean, as a comparison to the United States, I didn't know about that. Yet, although when he was writing the first wave of migration, 19th century, early 20th century, great migration that he was writing, it is true that the United States was the single most important recipient of immigrants. But less than 20% of all immigrants came to the United States. That means that more than 80% went someplace else. This is not the only country of immigrants, obviously. And that is actually similar today. Today, the United States receives less than 1/5 of all transnational immigrants globally. And the difference is that it is not anymore the single most important destination of transnational migrants. The European Union has now replaced the United States as in that position. Although now with the decline of the European Union, who knows what is happening in the last few days or last few months. Now, this US centrism was not particularly handy. It was particular to immigration history. It was common at the time. No one thought that it was interesting or peculiar. It was assumed. It was assumed. It is common, this US centrism, to US historiography in other realms, not only immigration history. In the case of slavery, African slavery, less than 4% of African slaves came to the United States, so the distinction is even greater. And there is very little knowledge in US historiography on slavery, about slavery elsewhere. Sometimes the British Caribbean, that's the further that they go. And never mind knowledge and awareness of slavery beyond the Americas. There is another huge slave market in North Africa, where you work on, right? There is almost total ignorance about that. And other forms of US centrism, which are national centrisms, are hidden, I think, to national histories, whether they're US or any other place. I think that national histories, by definition, are nation-centric and myopic, since it's part of a construction of a patriotic history, and it's not so much about learning about the world, or humans, or things like that. Now, it may be possible that this type of national parochialism or myopia is stronger in the United States. But that's simply a function of our size and our power. The bigger the countries and the more powerful that they are, the more internally oriented they become, right? The less cosmopolitan they become. Small countries cannot afford to be non-cosmopolitan. It would be impossible to be non-cosmopolitan, I don't know, in the Netherlands or Switzerland or in small places, but it is very easy. Actually, one of the other countries that is very internal and has very little curiosity about the rest is interesting, Russia, the other superpower. So it's related to power, concentration of power. Now, related to this, the other topic is not simply US centrism, but the notion of American exceptionalism. that is a stronger form of centrism, right? And in the case of handling, the shape that it takes is the notion of a nation of immigrants. Actually, the subtitle of the uproar is the epic story of the great migrations that made the American people. Now, at its highest point, only 14%, less than 15% of the US population was immigrant, was foreign born. That was around 1910, in 1980 I think it reached similar today is less than 13%. So at the highest point is 14%, right? Around, let's say, 1910. Well, around that time, that proportion was immigrant in Cuba. In Canada, it was 22%, so significantly higher. Australia, 23%, New Zealand, 24%. Argentina is twice as high. 30% of the population is immigrant. In Uruguay, it's even higher. 35% of the population is immigrant. Today, there are more than 40 countries in the world whose proportion of the population that is foreign born is much higher than the United States. Countries where, 70%, 40%, 55, 60%, right? Now, most of these countries do not call themselves nation of immigrants, country of immigrants, do not think of themselves as such. And the few that refer to themselves as nation of immigrants it is not as constant, as pervasive as it is in the United States. So the obvious question is, why? Why countries that are truly nations of immigrants, meaning that the great majority of the population is immigrant, do not call themselves such, and the United States keep on insisting it is? Well, I guess part of the answer could be a sense of national grandiosity, right? That we're such a great country that everyone wants to come to us. Which is actually some of the explanations to why we pay very little attention to return migration, which was actually quite substantial, sometimes 40% or half of the people return. Because it seems that if we're so great, how do you explain that people return? Right? That doesn't jive, it doesn't fit well with the notion of US as a magnet, as a beacon. Okay, that's an explanation, but that would work for other countries of immigrants, right? So that cannot explain why the US is so intense about this question. Something that Matt alluded to, another possible explanation that is preferable to emphasize free immigration than, let's say, the repression of Aboriginal people, right? The massacre of Aboriginal people. That's true, but that would also be true for Australia, for Argentina, for Uruguay, right? It's not particularly to the United States, so that doesn't explain it. It is also preferable to emphasize free immigration than slavery and the horrors of slavery in national history. But that would be true for Brazil, and that would be true for Cuba, and they don't make such a big deal about nations of immigrants. So that leads us, I think, and this is the key, to explain why this interest and this omnipresence of this metaphor of nation of immigrants. The old and new migrations in the United States, not the old meaning today and then, but the old meaning Western European immigration in the early part of the 19th century up to the 1880s and will continue later, and then the new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? There is nothing to that dimension in other countries of immigrants. There is not that clear this partition between a first wave from Northern and Southern, Northern Europe, Western and Northern Europe, and then a latter wave from Italians, Poles, Jews, and Eastern and Southern and Eastern European people who were considered inferior, and sometimes actually were considered almost racially inferior. That if they were either maybe non-white or an inferior version of whites, right? So in this sense, the notion of nation of immigrants, country of immigrants, who I think is a post-World War II phenomenon. I have been looking for pre-World War II references to this, and it was not nearly as omnipresent, right? It's basically a claim to membership. It's for a people who have been kept out, this narrative became a way of claiming that they belong to the country, right? Claiming membership in a polity that they were excluded from. And in that sense, the genealogy, right, of the personal history of handling plays into this, right? It is a way for ethnic whites, that is, whites of non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Northern European origins, of the last wave of descendants of the last wave of immigrants in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to create their own metaphor, to add their own metaphor to the other powerful metaphors in the history of the United States. The West, of which they were not part of, they were not seen as part of the West. And the other one is the Pilgrims, right? Which is very interesting. Great Migration, the Great Migration, before it was it was used to call the Eastern and Southern European migrations Great Migration. Great Migration is to refer to the Puritans' migration to New England. It wasn't that great in volume, but it's interesting that the term Great Migration was used, right? So this is a way of saying we also have a Great Migration, and actually also to exclude the other Great Migration, which is the African American migration from the South, which is also called. So I mean, this is almost a strategy to claim that we belong, but in order to have some value to the notion of membership, you also need to exclude others. A polity is like a social club that is free entrance, and anyone can belong to it, doesn't have much, symbolic value. So I think that there is an element here of also that we are in the Ellis Island, but someone has to be kept out. And that someone in the 50s and in the 60s were basically African Americans. Then other people were added to it, Puerto Ricans and then new immigrants. But so in a sense is part of a trajectory. How much more do I have? What? 2 more minutes?
A couple of minutes.
Okay. The last thing is about assimilation. Handlin's argument, that immigrants came and assimilated to integrate into the American society, was attacked by revisionist scholars in the 60s, in the 70s, that proposed cultural pluralism and multiculturalism, and it was not the melting pot, but the salad bowl, metaphors related to diversity, right? In part, this was reflected also a shift in view of the United States. For the generations of the 50s, for Handlin's generation, the United States was a beacon of freedom. For the generation that came to age in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, the United States seemed more like a racist country and an imperial power than a beacon of freedom for the rest of the world. So the hermeneutic power, explanatory power of nation, unity, mainstream, decline as the hermeneutic explanatory power of diversity, otherness, diversity, pluralism increase. The revisionists were right. There is a lot of continuity in ethnic identity in the United States. There are fascinating studies done about ethnic whites, people of Irish, Jewish, and Italian ancestry, done in the 60s and the 70s, in which they show that people had, depending on their background, they had very different attitudes to very primary concerns, like how to raise children, death, illness, family, even in cases where they were vaguely aware of their ethnic background. So this is powerful. Now, that is true, okay, so there is more continuity than we thought there was. But Hamlin was right, actually, in a global comparison, and that's what the global comparison comes in, compared to just about most other countries in the world. The United States, actually, what is striking about the United States is the speed of assimilation. I was talking to a student who came to see me the other day. She's originally from India, Gujarat, but her family has been in Tanzania, I forgot if it was Tanzania or Kenya, in East Africa, for actually 6 generations. Well, this woman still spoke a dialect of Gujarati. It was obvious that this woman in 6 generations, her family hadn't mixed with anyone else. The level of endogamy is incredible. I mean, she continued to think of herself as Indian, and I thought that was amazing. No, that is not amazing, actually. That's very common. Arabs do the same in East Africa, Lebanese in West Africa, Chinese in Southeast Asia. This is actually quite common. All different African ethnic groups in Ghana, where I was recently, where people 6, 7, 8 generations continue to identify, have very strong group identities. And this is true of, again, Sri Lanka. In the Americas, probably Trinidad is the, and Suriname would be the closest examples, right? So the power of assimilation, I think that American culture or society, not simply the government, this is not imposed by force, more than a melting pot, is actually a steamroller of diversity. Diversity becomes very minute. I mean, look, I always give the example of languages, which is a good indication. Jiddisch, the language of Eastern European Jewry, existed in Eastern Europe for a millennia as a minority language. In the United States, it disappeared in 2 or 3 generations. That's another thing to say in Brooklyn, but other than Brooklyn, yeah. And this is not only Jiddisch, this is about. Now, my point is that this is not US exceptionalism. This is American exceptionalism in the wider term of America, meaning the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. The same thing happened in Uruguay or in Canada or in Argentina, right? Most of these countries, people lose a sense of separate identity in 3 or 4 generations. It is very, compared to the example that I gave of this student originally from Gujarat, where you have 6 generations and no mixture. It will be impossible in the United States, actually, to find a 5th generation American who only comes from one ancestry, who hasn't been, their ancestors haven't been mixed. And so, and I think this continues. I don't think there is much of a difference between then and now. We talk about Latinos. I mean, Latinos is the same process. I see the same process happening. The American-born generation speaks Spanish, a broken Spanish, really. Their first language is English. It may be an English accented by a neighborhood, right? But they don't have a foreign accent, actually, because they don't speak a foreign language. The second, by the 3rd generation, definitely, very rare. So language lost and mixing also. Today does resemble what was happening among European immigrants before. It's simply that the process is younger, right? We will have to wait 2 or 3 more generations to tell, but it's moving in the right direction. Now, is that good that we have become such a homogeneous society? Probably not. We have lost a lot of beautiful diversity and language skills. So I'm not saying that it's desirable. I'm saying that compared to the rest of the world, that is actually quite striking. And then Hamlin had it right there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that very enlightening and broadening perspective on immigration and assimilation. I'm reminded of urban Asian parents who sometimes lament the fact that their children are American without having set foot on American soil. And so assimilation goes on out to the United States, goes on outside the borders of the US as well. Our final fabulous speaker is someone whose name you know very well. Juan Gonzalez is a columnist at New York Daily News. He also co-hosts Democracy Now! He is a prolific author, most recently with Joseph Torres of News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. And I think he has a little film plan for you, so.
Well, good morning, and I'm somewhat intimidated because I'm just a mere journalist, and here we've been hearing from three real luminaries, scholars on immigration. I spend most of my time trying to report the news that's happening each day, but there have been numerous occasions in my 35-year career now as a journalist where I've had to take forays into history to try to understand what is happening before my very eyes. Sometimes it's taken a few years of forays into that history to try to get a better understanding. And certainly the issue of immigration is one that I've dealt with throughout that 35-year career in journalism at one point or another. And so I think that this attempt to really assess the enormous impact that Oscar Handlen had on the study of immigration, or the American people's image of what immigration has meant to the country, is certainly an important endeavor. The thing, I was struck by what Matt said about how wonderfully written The Uprooted is. You know, there are a few books, historical books, that you really say this is a gem of literature. I mean, you can think of Anthony Lucas's Common Ground, or Bob Carroll's The Power Broker, but really a book that is not only a historical study, but really something that is almost a thrill to read. And in that sense, I think Handlen was really able to get to the essence of what the immigration experience was for so many millions of Europeans who came to this country. And you know, in his introduction, he mentions, my theme is immigration as the central experience of a great many human beings, broken homes, interruptions of a familiar life, separation from known surroundings, the becoming of a foreigner and ceasing to belong. These are the aspects of alienation, and seen from the aspect of the individual received rather than of the receiving society. That was I think to me, the first time I read the book, the other eye-opener. Let's look at this from the point of view of the people who went through the process, not from the point of view of the country that received them. And not only did they change, how did they change the country? The humanist aspect, I think Virginia said he was essentially a humanist who really tried to capture the enormous emotional experience that immigration represents. And it's an experience that takes generations to recover from, the emotional aspect of. And that's why I brought a clip to sort of capture some of that emotional experience for the immigrants of today. This is a film that hasn't yet come out, that'll be out in a couple of months, which is based on a book I wrote about 10 years ago, Harvest of Empire, History of Latinos in America. The film overall, like the book, tries to capture the impact of empire on migration. How has the existence of an American empire changed the nature of migration? And so it goes back into the histories of each of the countries and what was happening in those countries, and then follow some of the migrants who came and what did they go through. And this particular clip is about 3 minutes I'm going to show you, is about Guatemalans. And it first looks into what happened in Guatemala, and there's an interview with Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Guatemala. But then it focuses basically on a family here in the United States in Los Angeles and what they went through. So I'm just going to play that clip and then proceed.
Antillas.
This is the sort of the end of the Rigoberta Menchú interview.
En Guatemala, si lo que hay es persecución, es asesinato, es matanza, lo que hay es inseguridad de la vida. Yo prefiero romper la frontera e ir donde sentiré más seguridad. Los estadounidenses no tienen idea de por qué uno se viene a los Estados Unidos. No la tienen. Y si la tienen, yo creo que la tienen equivocada. Y fue bien difícil dejarla. Fue duro. Tenía 4 años, mira. Dejar tus hijos, eso no es fácil. Venir aquí, el precio que pagas es carísimo. No tiene precio. No tiene precio.
I was almost 7 years old when I came to LA to be reunited with my mother because she left Guatemala 3 or 4 years before I did. It was a very long trip. It was by bus, it was by car, by walking many, many miles. Going through the southern part of Mexico is one of the toughest parts. When it came to crossing the border, I had to say that the coyote was my father and that my grandmother was my mother. And we were coming to visit. The immigration officer asked me, like, what's your mom's name? And I said, Aura. And he asked me for my father's name, and I forgot. I forgot his name. Luckily, we were not sent back to Guatemala. We were not able to cross to the U.S. that first time because of my fault. But my grandmother is a person with a lot of persistence and a lot of tenacity, and she's like, no, we're gonna try again. On January 27, 1991, I came to LA. All I remember is seeing this really big pregnant woman running down the stairs, and I was worried that she was gonna fall off the stairs. And she lifted me up and she carried me and she was kissing me a lot. It was definitely very emotional. I think to some extent I did feel like a stranger. Like I think that I'm like, why is this woman hugging me so hard? And I was happy, but I was also to some extent confused of what's really going on. I think about that often, and I think that my children hopefully will be the first ones that there won't be a separation, you know, that I will be able to have my children and won't need to migrate, you know, to survive.
My first stop is going to be with Mrs. Dayan, the Pasadena convalescent home. Okay, now.
Grandma did come undocumented, and my mom came undocumented. I also came undocumented, and it took us over close to 20 years to be able to fix our status.
Cuando tú estás en Guatemala y tú piensas venirte para acá, tu plan no es quedarte, no. Pero cuando vienes aquí es otra historia. No le voy a decir a la gente, véngase o no véngase, pero el dinero aquí no crece en árboles, no. Y es más difícil cuando sos ilegal. Mucho más difícil. Oh, I feel a breeze. You feel it? Es amazing, es increíble para mí porque cuando yo vivía en Guatemala, yo no tenía ni idea de que existía Harvard.
She's like, oh, I'm holding it. So this is my diploma from Harvard University. Yeah, I can't believe it's my name in it.
Mariana Zambonis.
I think that my mom was given the opportunity to have achieved her educational dreams. She would have gone to Harvard. I believe she's a fighter.
You've got a whole.
That's a clip, the little clip I wanted to run. Clearly, I think that was in the spirit of what Handlin tried to do, was to talk about the human experience that immigration represents. And at the same time, as everyone has said, there's things have changed. Handlin changed, the nation changed, and the character of migration today, especially to the United States and to all of the advanced industrial countries, is very different. I think to me, the major difference for the United States is that, and for Europe as a whole, is that basically you have the people of the colonies coming to the metropolis. And they have a different relationship with the country they're going to than those who came from Europe, who were coming to the United States, who were really attempting to rewrite a new slate. There's a complicated relationship between the Algerians and the Tunisians and the Moroccans in France and the French government and the French people. There's a complicated relationship between the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Jamaicans in England and the English government, or between the Turks and the Turkish immigrants and the German government, and such. So there is a complicated relationship between the Latin Americans who have come to this country, especially since World War II, in that they're coming to the very country that in some way or other was involved in the dislocation of their own nations and their own societies, and necessitated them coming. So that this idea of coming for a time, not coming for the rest of your life, is ingrained in so many of the migrants these days. I remember one time talking to a Dominican livery driver who has lived in this country for years, but only for part of the year. He drives his cab in the spring and the summer in the United States, and then he goes back to his home in the Dominican Republic during the winters and the fall. And he is essentially a binational on a daily, year in, year out. That is what he has settled into. So that the issue then of, as Jose was talking about, the fast assimilation that's occurred here in the United States relative to other peoples, well, there's an aspect of the reality that the empire needs that. The empire doesn't make it easy to maintain your own culture and your own language. That's problematic in this country. So there is a constant effort to assure that English is the language of everyone, and that the acculturation process and the assimilation process occurs. So I think that, but of course there's the additional problem for Latin Americans, that because of the nature of how race and language has been dealt with throughout American history, those Latin Americans who come here, regardless of how they feel they are, eventually fall into some kind of a linguistic caste status. Even those who, the Latino offspring who speak English very well, speak little of the language of the country from which their parents came, still fall into a linguistic and caste status within the United States. So that, and of course the biggest immigrant, and I've always maintained when people talk about the immigration problem in the United States, that Mexico is the main source of immigrants and undocumented immigrants to the United States. Mexico also happens to be the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world with a 2,000-mile border with the United States. And Mexico has functioned throughout its history as a reserve labor pool for the United States. We are now in the third wave of mass deportations of Mexicans from the United States. The first wave was in the 1930s under President Hoover, when as many as 1 million, some people say 2 million, it's probably around 1 million, were massively deported from the United States. Then in the 50s, after a new migration had happened, you had Operation Wetback, again another mass deportation program of Mexicans, aimed at Mexicans, and now you have the latest, and the bulk of the people being deported under the Obama administration are Mexicans once again. So Mexico has functioned as a reserve labor force. In good times, the country wants cheap Mexican labor in, and in bad times, the country wants to export, deport Mexican labor. But therefore, Mexico has played a key role in the American economy in terms of supplying those laborers. So I think that the character of the migration has changed, and now we face the fact that somewhere between 2040, maybe 45, 2045, 50, a majority of the people living in the United States will trace their cultural and linguistic heritage not to Europe, but to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That's an enormous change in the picture that Handlin had in the early 1950s when he wrote the book, that less than 100 years later, the entire characteristic of the migration is going to have been transformed. Everyone's going to have to deal with that one way or another. So I mean, that's pretty much what I have to say. I know we'll have lots of questions and answers.